Okay, the reading for this week is a story by the great Meiji period female writer Higuchi Ichiyō, and the story is called This Child, or Konoko in the original, published in 1896, the year of her death. So Higuchi Ichiyō was born in 1872 and died tragically at a very young age, 24, 25, in 1896. And this translation is by Juliet Winters Carpenter, who is arguably the greatest living translator of modern Japanese fiction. And this story, both the original and her translation, will be included in my forthcoming book titled Modern Japanese Literature, a Bilingual Reader. And the book is intended for students of Japanese literature, both native Japanese speakers and foreign students who want to read some of the great works of modern Japanese fiction in both the original and in English translation, side by side, with study guides included after each story. All right, so I'll put the link to that book, forthcoming book, in the description below, and you can purchase it next year when it comes out. And there are many, many great stories. I'll probably include 20 or 25 great works of modern Japanese fiction in that book. All right. Higuchi Ichiyō, we've read several of her stories in this class. I haven't made videos yet, but those of you who some of you will have already read her and are already familiar with her work and her style and her focus on the sort of lower classes of Tokyo in the mid-Meiji period. She was a novelist and poet born in Tokyo in 1886. So at the age of 14, she entered the Haginoya Poetry Academy that was run by Nakajima Utako. Her father's death in 1889 forced her to earn the family's living, so she lived most of her life in extreme poverty. Died in poverty. In 1891, she became a pupil of Nakarai Tosei and began writing stories. Her story Umoregi, Undiscovered Wood, published in 1892, became a breakthrough hit and won her contacts with people in the Bungakkai, the literary world, of the Bundam. To earn a living, she also ran a shop dealing in household goods and cheap sweets at Ryusenji-machi in Shitayaku, so in the old Shitamachi area of Tokyo. And her stories are all set in this sort of the downtown or the lower city of Tokyo, the Shitamachi area. Higuchi left not only novels such as Otsugomori, 1894, Nigorie, Maribe, 1895, and Take Kurabe. These last two are her most famous, I think, Nigorie and Take Kurabe, Growing Up, 1895. But also her diaries. She died in poverty of lung tuberculosis. So she died of kekkaku, which is a very common disease, and many great writers succumbed to tuberculosis in the Meiji and Taisho periods. Kaji Motojiro included, whose story Lemon we've already read. She died in poverty of lung tuberculosis. Ichiyō communicated with Wakamatsu Shizuko prior to this work, which is said to have inspired by this exchange. Okay, so Wakamatsu Shizuko, she's another writer of the period, and they were in communication when she wrote this this work that I'm about to read right now. Tragically, both died the same year. Okay, all right. And here's the story. It's a short story. I'll read the entire thing in Carpenter's masterful English translation, and we'll go over the original and this story in more depth in class. I haven't made a study guide yet for this story, but I will do so sometime soon and make another video where I discuss the questions on the study guide and some more information about this work and about Higuchi Ichiyō. Okay, here's the work. If I came right out and said this child means the world to me, everyone would laugh. What mother hates her own child, after all? It would sound ridiculous, as if I thought I alone were blessed with such a treasure. And so I'll never say anything so extravagant, but in my heart I do adore him. He's so precious I could press my palms together in reverent thanks. He's my guardian angel. All he does is laugh sweetly and play innocently, but that smile of his has taught me more than I could ever say. The books I read in school and the lessons I learned from my teachers were beneficial, of course, and I think back on them whenever I have the chance. Yet none of them has the power of this little one's smile to stop my hurried steps and still my frenzied thoughts. Unlike the opinions that brilliant scholars declaim over people's heads, the sight of him sleeping in all innocence with his head on his beanbag pillow and his little arms outstretched, his hands by his shoulders, brings heartfelt tears to my eyes. So for all my obstinate pride, I could never pretend he doesn't mean the world to me. At the end of last year, when I heard his newborn cry and saw his little face for the first time, I was in such a daze that, although it wrings my heart to remember it now, all I could think was, why did you have to be born healthy? If you'd been born dead, I could have gone back to my parents' house as soon as I recovered, and not stayed near that husband of mine 1 second more. Oh, why were you born healthy? I can't bear it. Must I live without a glimmer of hope, tied to that man forever? I thought only about how miserable I was, how wretched, and how people offered me congratulations, I didn't feel happy at all. And when people offered me congratulations, I didn't feel happy at all. I only felt sad at the prospect of my life becoming still more constrained. Okay, so I haven't made the study questions yet, but one of the questions will be describe the transformation that occurs in her feeling toward her baby, her feeling toward her husband, and so forth. In the beginning, she's very bitter. She hates her husband, and eventually she comes to the light and realizes what her duties are in life, and so forth. So it's kind of a story that conforms to the starts with rebellion against the Confucian norms about what a woman should be, and it ends with a kind of reconciliation with that worldview. All right, it's just the only commentary I'll give while reading this. Okay, next paragraph. But anyone in my situation would have felt the same way. I'm sure you'll agree. Anyone. No matter how gracious and enlightened a lady she might be, would be bound to grow despondent and depressed. My complaints about his cruelty and indifference, about the lack of justice in the world, weren't just a sign of temper. Anyone would have said the same things. In my mind, I wasn't the least bit at fault and hadn't done anything wrong, so I blamed every falling out on my husband. I was in a perpetual blaze of resentment. And the thought that by marrying me off my own parents, he's the same as a parent to me, an uncle to whom I'm indebted, the thought that my own parent had condemned me to a lifetime of suffering made me resent him too. Above all, since I'd done nothing wrong, had obediently gotten married just as I was told, I deeply resented God or whatever power it was that had inflicted such a fate on me, like pushing a blind man over a cliff. In short, I was convinced that this world is a disagreeable place. People say a strong spirit is a good thing, that without it you can never get anything difficult accomplished. A person lacking determination is as spineless as a sea slug, they say. But it's all a matter of time and place. Flaunting your spirit day and night doesn't do you the slightest good. A woman may be better off keeping her determination under wraps and quietly apprising herself of things. Someone like me who wears her emotions on her sleeve and can't yield gracefully must strike others as shameless. I'm sure my husband used to sigh over what a terrible wife I was. But at the time, unable to stop and reflect on my behavior, I couldn't read his mind. His looks of displeasure grated on my nerves, and if he was cross with me at all, I'd get hot with anger. There were times I couldn't stop myself from answering back. More often I'd refuse to speak or eat, and take my anger out on the maids. More than once I went to bed and wouldn't get up all day. I weep easily, and for all my stubborn pride I'd shed helpless tears, biting the collar of my bedclothes in sheer frustration. I wept in fury that I couldn't make my will prevail. When I came here as a bride 3 years ago, we got on well enough, and neither of us had any complaint, but familiarity is both good and bad. It wasn't long before our underlying willfulness showed through. Desires and dissatisfactions of every sort came out. I even had the nerve to demand to know what he did outside the home. You keep things from me, I said bitterly. You never talk to me about what you do, and that can only mean you want to hold me at arm's length." He laughed and wouldn't take my grievance seriously. "I'd never be so unfriendly," he said. "You know I'd tell you anything." I could see as plain as day that he was concealing things, and it killed me. Once I started being suspicious, my suspicions multiplied 10 and 20-fold. Morning and night I obsessed about what I took to be his lies, my thoughts a knotty tangle of suspicion. Now, looking back, it seems only natural that he kept things from me. Okay, so she's writing a personal account about her own experiences in the past, writing about herself in a kind of memoir style, but it's as if she's writing about a different person because she's transformed so so fundamentally, right? So it's almost as if she's looking at her past self as somebody else and describing it objectively from this new perspective that she now inhabits. Now, looking back, it seems only natural that he kept things from me. A woman's tongue is careless. It wouldn't have done for him to tell me about his work. To this day he keeps a great many things from me, and I understand. So she's happy, she's fine with it now, that there are secrets between them. Before she demanded that he reveal everything to her, but now she understands that that's sort of modern folly. Even though I know he isn't being open with me, it doesn't rankle me at all. Saying nothing about his work in a matter of principle with him, I now see, and he was only right to hold firm no matter how I cried and carried on. Back when I was acting so irresponsibly, had he ever spoken to me of what went on at court? Back when I was acting so irresponsibly, had he ever spoken to me of what went on at court, there's no telling what senseless things I might have done. As it was, a great many people used to come round to the house, plaintiffs and defendants alike, trying to ply me with gifts and pouring out their troubles with assurances that the coming verdict was a matter of life and death. I never had anything to do with any of them, though I didn't excuse myself straightforwardly and honestly, as the wife of Judge Noboru Yamaguchi ought to have done. There's his name for the first time. Underline his name, her husband's name. He's a judge. His name is Noboru Yamaguchi. In view of our constant bickering, I couldn't possibly have brought up such matters with him, and rather than suffer through a lecture, it seemed better to greet all petitioners with silence. That was the extent of my thinking. Fortunately, it was enough to keep away the taint of bribery, but the gulf between my husband and me kept on growing, rancor deepened, and slowly we became unfathomable strangers to each other. I now realize, so again, here's her new self talking, I now realize that this was all my own doing. So she came to the light, she began to see that it was all her own fault that there was such rancor between the two. My behavior was undeniably bad, and my misguided attitude is what made him go wrong. Thinking of it now, I can't hold back tears of regret. At the lowest point in our relationship, we each turned our back on the other. When we went out, I didn't ask where he was going, and he left no word for me of his destination. If a message came while he was out, no matter how urgent it was, I never even broke the seal. Though I was his wife, I accepted all such missives stonily, and sent the messenger away without reply. When my husband found such a letter callously tossed aside, naturally he'd be angry. He'd scold me, reason with me, lecture me, cajole me, but I stayed obstinate, and so resentful of his everlasting secretness that a kind word here and there had no effect. Finally he lost patience and gave up. While we were quarreling, things weren't so bad, but when we stopped speaking and just looked frostily at one another, even though our home had a roof and walls, it was bleaker than any bed out in the open, and so cold it's a wonder why my tears didn't turn to ice. When you think about it, people are self-centered. As long as things are going well, they don't remember the past, but in times of anguish and unhappiness, their thoughts turn to what used to be and what might have been, which they envision as the most wonderful, marvelous, splendid time imaginable. The more they do this, the more detestable their present situation becomes, until they're desperate to sever their ties and escape. If only they could get away, they think. They could go someplace pleasant and beautiful. I was caught up in the same sort of fantasy. Surely I wasn't meant to end my days in such an unhappy marriage. Before I was married, when I was the adopted daughter of Mr. Komuro, various people introduced suitors to me, and I had a number of offers. A naval officer named Ushi Oda made a great impression on me, and I was almost engaged to a handsome physician named Hosoi. But somehow I ended up the wife of this uncommunicative man instead. There had to be some mistake. It seemed too cruel to let the mistake go uncorrected and endure a lifetime of suffering as a result. And so I made no effort to discipline my emotions, but simply envied others. Faced with a wife whose head was filled with troublesome thoughts like these, and whose treatment of him was equally troublesome, how could the finest man be kind? When my husband came home from work, I greeted him mechanically, with never a warm word. I was curt, all but inviting him to lash out at me. He found such treatment so intolerable that he would turn and leave. This behavior of his tormented me, and I resented him all the more for it. But to be truthful, I didn't know how to calm him. He left only because I made life at home so disagreeable that he couldn't wait to get away. And that's how I pushed my husband into a life of dissipation. So it's her fault that he falls into dissipation and debauchery. He became a regular man about town, and a stranger at home. He wasn't like a rich man's wastrel son, though, someone susceptible to the flattery of a geisha who gives himself over to fast living. Deep down, he never really enjoyed himself. He was just trying to contain his aggravation and lift his spirits. When he went drinking, he never got pleasantly drunk, but turned ashen, and a blue vein throbbed at his temple. His speech turned harsh and rough. He lit into the servants over little things and gave me sidelong, contemptuous looks. He didn't scold me, but he was peevish, with no trace of the gentle ways he has now. When he glowered, I sat behind him full of indignation. This was hard on the servants, and we had a steady turnover of 2 per month. Every time someone left, great quantities of objects around the house would go missing or turn up damaged. I could only wonder how there could be so many heartless people in one place. Was society itself heartless, or did people around me turn heartless just to set me off? Whichever way I turned, there was no one to rely on. I was in despair. I made no effort to be gracious to guests. When my husband's colleagues came to the house, I didn't show myself unless he ordered me to. Otherwise, I had a servant to take my place, pleading toothache or headache as my excuse. I dressed as I pleased, whether we had company or not, and didn't so much as answer when spoken to. I can't imagine what people must have thought of my behavior. They must have said that I'd be the ruin of the Yamaguchi family, that as a wife I was a complete and utter disgrace. Alright, so anybody's read Tanizaki's Chiji no Ai, or Naomi, as translated by Anthony Chambers, might see some resemblance here between Naomi, Tanizaki's Naomi, and this narrator protagonist here. If my husband had ever mentioned divorce, I'm sure I'd have leaped at the chance for freedom without thinking twice. I'd have shut my eyes to the impropriety of such a thing, deciding that if Providence decreed such a miserable, mortifying end for me, so be it. I'd become anything, live as I saw fit, even if it meant going to the dogs, and consider myself lucky if by some remote chance things turned out well. I shuddered to think what might have become of me if I'd acted on such wild notions. How lucky I am that my husband never did divorce me. Of course, for all I know, perhaps he was so exasperated with me that he deliberately chose to make me suffer by keeping me confined rather than granting me easy freedom. But I have no resentment. I don't feel the slightest bitterness toward my husband, since my present happiness is owing to the difficult time he put me through. The pain of those experiences had enabled me to become a person of greater understanding. With that in mind, I have no reason to bear a grudge against anyone, even my personal maid Haya, who used to be rattle-brained and quick to advertise my faults, and the cook Katsu, who used to be a sharp-tongued lazy bones. can now well be counted among my greatest allies. None but excellent servants like these come to work here anymore. I'd even heard people say, no one is so good to servants as the mistress here. Incredible yet gratifying. It's all because I came to see that everyone's uncooperativeness was the reflection of my own attitude. Society has no rogues who go about causing random suffering, nor does God send heartbreak to those who are entirely innocent of wrongdoing. But because I never set out deliberately to do wrong, even someone like me, a person whose home life was built entirely on misapprehension, a troublemaker with nothing to recommend her, was granted this darling, this beautiful baby boy. Okay. So the baby is what has sparked her transformation, obviously. Just before he was born, I was enveloped in a cloud of ill will that lingered on quite a while even afterward. Yet from the moment he uttered his first cries, my heart went out to him. If anyone were to try to take him away now, I'd abandon all pride and wrap my arms around him tightly as if to say, he's mine and I won't let you lay a finger on him. It was this child who taught me that my husband and I think alike. I used to squeeze him and say, you don't belong to Papa, you're all mine. Mama will take you with her wherever she goes, and never ever leave you behind. You're mine, all mine. When I kissed him on the cheek, his face lit up with a smile that made me melt. He smiled so adorably that I was convinced he couldn't possibly belong to a hard-hearted beast like my husband. He must be mine alone. When my husband came home, he'd go sit at the baby's bedside with a disconsolate air, clumsily hold up a pinwheel or a rattle, and tell him, you're the only one in this household who's any comfort to me. I'd watch him rub his swarthy cheeks against the baby's, certain the little thing would burst into tears or act frightened, but instead, to my surprise, his face lit up in a smile, exactly the way it does with me. One day my husband twirled his mustache and asked me if I thought the baby was sweet. Naturally, I said primly. In that case, you're sweet too, he said in a joking way, unlike his usual self. When he laughed out loud, there was no denying that the baby's face took after his. Once I saw that, since the baby does mean the world to me, how could I hate my husband? I softened toward him, and he towards me. Out of the mouths of babes, they say. But the one who taught me a life-changing lesson was an infant too young to speak. All right. So the baby has fundamentally transformed her from a kind of modern woman who rebels against her husband to a more traditional Tradwife, as we might say today, who has reached a harmonious relationship with her husband and with her child. All right, we'll discuss more about this in detail and try to get to the motivations and the intent that behind the work. All right, that's all for now. Goodbye.